Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. An advantage which benefits only the American 1%. The Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people on the excuse of 9/11, but the U.S. hasn't maintained that control. The Obama administration, nevertheless, has not stopped trying for it or stopped killing people, although they have managed to hide much of what they're doing from the American people, if not from the rest of the world. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, but he is in fact creating terrorists in response particularly to his drone killings, which have been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. His ongoing drone campaign, the New York Times says he chooses the targets himself, has already killed more than 6,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. He has also attacked 8 countries, 2 more than President Bush, and he directs a private presidential army called the Special Operations Forces of more than 70,000 people, active in more than 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Today, the Obama administration is conducting wars throughout the Mideast, acting with belligerence towards China, and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine that has already killed more people than America's client Israel killed in Gaza in 2014. The U.S. supports Israel's attacks on its neighbors and its illegal occupation of Palestinians' territories, not just because of the influence of an Israel lobby in the U.S. There are, in fact, lobbies with even more influence on the U.S. government, notably the so-called defense lobby, weapons makers. Israel, in fact, is the U.S. government's stationary aircraft carrier in the Mideast for U.S. domination of the region. We must demand of Obama and his successor, probably Hillary Clinton, that they, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and mercenaries home, 3, closed 1,000 foreign U.S. bases in the Mideast and elsewhere. No other country has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia in Ukraine and China in the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Kurds to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars, which are the result, after all, of America's interventions in the region. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine," close quote. However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much about it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight on our 12th night program, beginning with Ron Zoke and his little friend here.
Oh, yes. Well, that's my reminder again of the wars that are going on, the killing, shooting, burning, bombing, bleeding, dying. That's still going on every day despite our efforts here and the efforts of a lot of other people who are trying to stop it. Anyway, a number of minor points. A big item in the news this week is the increasing tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two biggest powers in the Middle East, apparently. Where that is going and what's behind it is still a little mysterious to me, what its implications will be, but it's not a good sign, and I think we should be concerned. The week has brought news of a film by Michael Moore, which sounds very interesting. I hope it will play locally sometime soon. Where to Invade Next, which is apparently a tour of a number of European countries which have better systems in some respects than ours, especially of welfare and safety net programs and that kind of thing. Many people are surprised to learn that the USA is so near the bottom of the list of supposedly advanced industrial countries on such indexes as child poverty and child welfare. Generally, the statistics concerning children in this country, their life and support after birth is really very discouraging. More news of conservatives complaining that they are not getting an affirmative action, apparently, program in academia. There are so many more liberals, even among the so-called hard scientists now, that we have to ask them, what is your quota? I mean, how many would be enough? Why this, you're complaining about this disparity? And of course, we know the humanities and social sciences are overwhelmingly liberal and vote Democratic, but our conservative friends are complaining that there's something unfair about this and keep suggesting, although they can't say it openly, of course, that there should be some kind of affirmative action program, and we need to deliberately set about hiring more people who are conservatives and vote Republican and all of that. Next problem is the increasing problem or prominence of the problem of malfeasance by prosecutors, and in Chicago and Cleveland and other places. I was on a grand jury once, and it was so striking that the jury, 20-some people, was really eating out of the hand of the prosecutor, and after a while they became a little more skeptical and stopped giving him automatically everything that he wanted. But the American prosecutorial institution is still, it seems to be, deeply inadequate. There's a need to bring in outside prosecutors in many cases that are not buddy-buddy with the police, and it's an increasing problem. The police, by the way, over the last few years have been averaging over 1,100 kills of citizens in this country. And why is that? Continuing mystery, because in all of the other supposedly advanced industrial countries, the figure is in the single digits typically. So why is it that we're killing over 1,000 or 1,100 each year by who are being gunned down by the police, and these other countries have so few? Is there some sudden change in human nature that takes place at the boundaries, at the borders of the USA? Well, I don't think so. I'll skip the part about that I call droppings from the racetrack. That is the horse race that's going on and will be with us, I'm afraid, through November 8th. I'm already fed up with it, but a lot of people are also, I believe. What I really want to call to your attention today is the situation going on in Palestine, Israel. What hit the papers this week in the Wall Street Journal and then elsewhere was the interference by Bibi, Benjamin Netanyahu, of the American in the American debate over the Iran nuclear deal, and he was recorded, spied upon, as they say, by the National Security Agency, and this has raised an enormous flap that in some quarters that we're spying on our allies, neglecting the fact that Israel has been spying on the American government and lobbying it, trying to influence it for months and years. And when confronted with this fact, they will retreat to the position, well, everybody spies on everybody else, which is quite true. And why they think we should be indignant about discovering this is going on somewhere is, again, a little foolish, it seems to me. What's been notable in the press, in addition to the war of attrition that's going on constantly between Palestinians and Israelis, is the rightward lurch, we might call it, in Israel itself, and the book ban, a novel that's been published there, which depicts a kind of a love affair between a Palestinian man and an Israeli woman. And it has been officially deleted from the list of books to be read in their equivalent of a high school because it might promote miscegenation. That word has not come up for a long time, and I was surprised to read it again. But there it is. So this is lending more color to the thesis, which has been advanced more and more by some people, that Zionism is or has become Jewish fascism. And I can testify to this. Once upon a time, I was very much in favor of it as what I thought Zionism was at the time. And the early socialist communities, the kibbutzim in Israel and so on, it was a fine, brave thing. They were starting a new society and bringing a new way of life to the Jews who were fleeing from Europe. So when did it turn bad? When did it go over to the dark side? Well, no single point in time, but I think a symbolic turning point might have been the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish fanatic in 2005. So since then, there's been a lot of churning and upset among American Jews about what has happened to Israel under the current right-wing regime. And an interesting piece has just appeared in a new publication, online publication, called Plus 972, which is apparently the telephone code for the Israel-Palestine area. Piece by Lisa Goldman, which I recommend to you. The old Zionist rhetoric is losing its hold on younger Jews, and they're saying no to that. American Jews still overwhelmingly vote Democratic, at least 70%, and identify themselves as liberals. But there's an older generation of Jews who will still keep talking about the Holocaust and flinging accusations of anti-Semitism and Jew-hating and all the rest. And a lot of the younger people, especially since the Gaza war of 2004, the summer of 2004, have been looking more and more skeptically at that and repudiating the old line. So I see some signs of hope there for a more reasonable approach. And I'm afraid what we now know as Zionism, as embodied in the State of Israel, has so largely gone over to the dark side that I'm very much concerned about what the outcome will be. And well, that should be provocative enough. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. In fact, we will go back around after everybody's had a chance to speak and make some comments on what's been said. I certainly have some.
Yeah.
And one quick one right now. The article you mentioned, Lisa Goldman,
Yeah.
Where is that and what is that?
It's an online magazine called Plus 972.
I see. And what does she say?
Oh, it's just about the generational shift that's occurred.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
What Max Blumenthal's been talking about
yeah,
in Israel
yeah.
and so forth.
And this phenomenon of the old, new version of Zionism,
I see.
if there is one, or repudiation of the old one anyway, which emphasized that Israel is going to be a place of safety for Jews. They should all go there so they could be safe from Holocaust and anti-Semitism and all of that. The paradox of that to me is that Jews are more physically, overtly unsafe in the State of Israel than anywhere else in the world.
Absolutely true.
Concentration, right.
Thank you very much. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go to Karen Aram and pivot to Asia.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I want to talk first about Vietnam, and I don't have a lot of information on this since I only got it this morning. This always happens to me. Right before I'm ready to come into the show, I get something that I hadn't seen before that I think overrides everything else that I have to talk about. Basically, they're accelerating their military buildup, planning for war. A Reuters report says very distinctly that senior officers and other highly placed sources in Hanoi told Reuters that Vietnam's strategy has moved beyond contingency planning into full-scale preparation for war. Key Army units, including the Elite Division 308, which guards the mountainous north, have been placed on high combat readiness to fend off any sudden attack. And of course, we're referring to China. That's the assumption. Now, in line with the corporate media's demonizing of China, as everyone in the West tends to do, over their intensification of hostilities in the South China Sea. I'm sorry, let me correct that. Over the intensification, it's not necessarily China's intensification. Reuters has falsely depicted Vietnam's military buildup as defensive. It claimed that the turning point was China's positioning in May 2014 of an oil rig just 80 nautical miles from Vietnam's coast. The dispute escalated into a dangerous confrontation between Chinese ships and the Vietnamese Coast Guard. Now, the oil rig was in fact set up near the Paracel Islands, which are claimed by both countries, but have been controlled by China since 1974. The area overlaps a Vietnamese oil exploration block, which Hanoi had earlier awarded to the U.S. energy giant ExxonMobil. Now, the U.S. is providing Vietnam with U.S. $18 million to purchase 2 U.S.-made patrol boats as a prelude to the co-production of weapons and defense supplies, seeking to curtail Russian military influence in the region or within Vietnam. I won't go into more detail on this since I'm actually really not as familiar with this material, having only briefed it, but to also point out that the Vietnamese leadership is engaged in a delicate balancing act. While not an official U.S. ally, it has tilted markedly towards Washington. Despite long-standing economic ties with China, its largest trading partner. Now, I keep hoping that business will override military. Now, in an attempt to counter America's growing influence, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Vietnam and Singapore in November, promoting China's Belt and Road Trade and Infrastructure Initiative, which includes major transport and power plant construction projects in Vietnam with financing from the Bank of China. So now this is important because there is an election coming up in Vietnam later this month to select the new leadership of the VCP. And basically, a commentary in The Diplomat in November said that Xi's visit was also intended to boost the pro-China faction within the VCP leadership, co-led by Party Secretary Pu Trong and Defense Minister Phung Quang Thang. Tensions between these elements and the more U.S.-oriented faction of Prime Minister Nguyen Tan Dung are likely to be a major factor in the party Congress. And since the current Prime Minister is Dung, who is more closely related or more closely bending remarkably towards the U.S., we can hope that there will be some change. I also want to point out that back in December, there was an article related to the WTO. They buried the Doha round. This is another rupture in the post-war order. I won't go into detail on that now. And I think something of great significance is that also this was the end of December. This is an article by Michael Hudson, who has written extensively on the economics. I think, Carl, you may have mentioned it on the air last week and before, but I think this is very important, the IMF changing its rules in order to isolate China and Russia. And again, I'm not going to go into all the rule changing, but what it amounts to is that the rule whereby you don't loan money to a nation that you know is simply cannot pay you back. You don't lend money to a nation that's at war, involved in war, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, they have changed the rules now to allow the Ukraine to forfeit on their loans from Russia, while at the same time giving them more money from the U.S. And then we look at what the EU's reaction was to Greece, and you see such a distinct contrast. So this is very important. So I think that's something we need to go into in more detail. On the issue that Ron mentioned about about the movie that Michael Moore has coming out, where do we invade next? I had an article, this goes back to mid-December, related to the West now preparing a new war and ground operations against Libya. And this morning I noted an article that David Johnson, our colleague, had posted, and I didn't get beyond the headlines, but basically the headlines were that there are now 6,000 British ground troops in Libya. And of course the usual raison d'etre is to counteract ISIS. But I have no more information on that, but that probably plays into what we were talking about, what two of you gentlemen were talking about earlier. And then the only thing I do think we do have to keep in mind what is happening in the Middle East, the tensions in the wake of the Saudi mass beheadings. I've been looking into and reading several different articles. What I do come up with, everybody's in the dark about that, and Carl, you kept saying, boy, I'll bet Foggy Bottom is keeping the lights on at night over this one. And I think you're quite right. But I've got information from the usual left organization, World Socialist website this morning by Bill Van Auken. And it does correspond to that from Ian Bremer, who is hardly a leftist. He's what I call a corporate guru. He is the president and founder of the Eurasia Group. But he was pretty much saying the same thing, and that's that Saudi Arabia is suffering economic problems right now, primarily due to the oil collapse. But they've got something like, I think he said 15,000 princelings to support. I can't believe it's 15,000, but either way, they are having, right, oh yeah, they're all family. But either way, we know that the best way to keep people unfocused from your domestic problems is to provide a external problem, our external enemy or monster. But there is concern about ISIS. And this is an issue that they are in fear of ISIS taking over throughout the region. But it really does also boil down to the fact that they fear that with the U.S. Relationship with Iran, that we may be walking away from some of their concerns, or walking away from them a bit. And from the left, he's saying that according to the Washington, now they're quoting the Washington Post here, who is saying that it attributes Riyadh's reckless moves to Saudi perceptions that the U.S. is no longer willing or able to stop Iran's drive for Middle Eastern hegemony, forcing, did I say that right, hegemony?
There are several schools.
I know, and there are several schools to a lot of the words I say, so I was going through them this week and I mispronounced, but I'm also influenced by European speakers of these words, so that comes into, that's my excuse. Anyway, to Middle Eastern hegemony and forcing Sunni regimes to act in their own defense. Now, in the end, both editorials, that's from the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, have pointed out that the same supposed remedy for the destruction and bloodshed wrought by both U.S. imperialism and its Saudi client state in the Middle East is the escalation of militarism and the preparation of new and even wider wars directed against both Iran and Russia. So that's the prescription that our government, our corporate government, is more likely to follow, according to the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, is more war. The thing that really is so frustrating, though, is that I think we just sold something like $50 million worth of, or was it 50 billion? Again, I don't have the figures correct. Oh, here it is, 4 billion. Billions of dollars worth of weapons, military weapons, to Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I guess they're concerned, but I think primarily they're using those weapons against Yemen, and they don't want to have to use it to defend themselves. So.
Thank you, Karen. This is in the old SDS motto, everything is connected. I'm afraid it's true. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go to Stuart Levy.
I wanted to say something not directly about a current event, but a sort of ongoing organizing principle. I wanted to say something about solidarity. So here's the story. A few years ago, there was a visit to here in Champaign-Urbana by a very interesting character, an activist and academic from South Africa named Richard Pithouse, and he's associated with the shack dwellers movement in South Africa around Durban, and their similar movements sprang up around other cities. So what the shack dwellers do is to occupy land in cities, in places where, you know, it's not basically where it's not impossible to live, where you can go a reasonable distance to get food or to find work or to be educated, you know, to educate your children, or and they were building shacks just out of whatever they could find in these spaces and living there. And the cities were doing the neoliberal thing that cities want to do everywhere, and or around that cities routinely do around the world, and they wanted to kick these poor people out and turn the land to more profitable purposes. And in exchange, they said they would build housing. They'd actually go and provide housing for these same people on the far outskirts of town, where people had no access to anything. And so the shack dwellers movement rose up and resisted this by just by being obstreperous and by using the government's own legal processes against it, and by suing the government, by a whole slew of different mechanisms. But they thought of themselves as a democratic movement organized from the bottom up, a movement of poor people, sort of organized by and for poor people, which didn't mean that only poor people could participate, but they would have to participate as a democratic part of the process. So there they were, and there they still are after about 10 years. They're still active. And so, well, one of the stories that Pithouse told about the Abahlali movement people, and as far as I understand, they were people who had grown up around the cities where they were living. They weren't migrants who had come to settle there. They were just trying to make spaces for themselves. All right. So in this context, around the time of the economic collapse, there was a migration of a lot of people from a number of countries in southern Africa. So Zimbabwe and Mozambique and probably others coming to South Africa. And you might remember that there was a great deal of violence, some of it really effectively supported by the ANC government. But there was a lot of violence against these people of the same sort as we see in the US against migrants from Latin America and elsewhere, and Central America, saying, these people are coming to take our jobs, we don't want them, they're no responsibility of ours, and so on. The Abahlali movement people not only did not participate in that rejection, they actively took in these people who were being set upon by by others in their same cities, and they sometimes would take them into their own houses, into their own shacks, places where they had nothing, where they had no, they certainly couldn't expect support from the police if the people they took in turned out to be troublesome. They exercised solidarity. They saw these people, although they had no, they were foreigners, they didn't share a common tribal background. For all I know, they might not have shared a common linguistic background. What they had in common was their poverty, and they saw them as brothers and welcomed them. I think this is a really important example. I think it's important for us to think, for anyone who wants to think about changing the society, to think about what the sources of solidarity might be and what the obstacles to solidarity might be. And to celebrate examples like this one where we can, and to understand this. A reason that I think we should be thinking about this now is in the light of arguments over race and racism in America. When if you've been reading the Facebook page, Carl will regularly post on identity politics, which seems to me to be a politics of division. But it's not the only way to talk about race, and that's why I want to bring up solidarity in this context. The way that I think talking about racism is especially important is in order not to celebrate division and not to legitimize division. That's the mechanism of the 1%, to say there are many separate pools and they each should celebrate their own separateness. Not that that's not an important thing to do, but what's needed is the reason that it's important to recognize separateness is because that separateness gets used to divide people, just as the separateness of the foreigners coming into South Africa was used effectively to divide people, to divide their humanity from that of the people who were already living in South Africa. It's important when it's 10 times as likely for a black person to be stopped for jaywalking in Champaign-Urbana than it is for a white person. It's important to recognize that as a difference that solidarity should be bridged across. If I go and say, my interactions with the economic system, my interactions with the police suit me just fine. I see justice, and I have no reason to object to them, and I see no reason to change anything. If I see it only from my own point of view, then the division of society has been successful. It succeeded in preventing people from unifying to work against injustice. That's why I think it's important to recognize the differences that the divisions that get imposed on us, and to bridge them rather than to pretend that they don't exist. So on solidarity, unity, and recognition of division, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Stuart. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we've argued all along that the question of the U.S. government's war policy around the world is bound up with domestic policies here at home, that they're not separable. Politics does not stop at the water's edge, as the U.S. tried to insist throughout the Cold War, and to understand these connections is, in many cases, the beginning of wisdom. What we'll do now is go around and make some comments on what's been said so far this evening, and discuss the difficult matters that have been raised already. I'd like to say a word to begin about the Saudi Arabian Iranian dispute that has been featured in a fairly one-sided fashion, I think, in the papers this week. The week began with Saudi Arabia executing 47 people, including a well-known Shia cleric, and exacerbating as a result the dispute that takes many forms between the so-called Sunni alliance, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Emirates in the Persian Gulf, on the one side as the Sunni alliance, and the Shia alliance on the other, that is Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Iraq, and recently Russia. Now this is serious. It's not simply a local dispute. It raises the most serious questions of international competition, and particularly the most serious questions of American foreign policy. American foreign policy is the overriding concern, simply because America is the principal actor in the region, the principal actor in terms of financing weapons, as Karen was describing, in terms of its own military activities, which in the Bush-Obama years have killed over 1 million people in the Mideast, to confirm American hegemony over the there's another way of doing it. American hegemony over the economic resources of the region, the energy resources of the region. But what the U.S. is doing here is, I think, necessary to think about in order to understand what Saudi Arabia and Iran are doing. There has been much in the American press about the Obama administration's so-called Iran deal, where the U.S. is presumably working against the nuclear activities of the state of Iran. The complaint has been that the Iranians are looking to build an atomic weapon, and we've heard that particularly from the Israelis, as if one nuclear weapon in Iranian hands would be any sort of challenge to the more than 200 high-tech nuclear weapons that Israel has. So the notion there's something else is at stake here seems to me to be quite right. What's at stake is this pattern of alliances that the U.S. has used to control the Mideast essentially since the Second World War. What the U.S. is doing in its Iranian deal is trying to get Iran back on board in this pattern of alliances. Iran slipped out of American control in 1979, a control that had been established by a coup against a democratic government that the U.S. had carried out in 1953. Ever since the 1979 revolution, the U.S. has been working to restore the status quo ante, to get Iran back into the overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger called it, by which the U.S. controlled the Middle East. And the Iran deal, the recent Iran deal, is a step in that direction. It really has very little to do with nuclear weapons, much more to do about the sanctions against Iran and the willingness of Iran to follow orders from Washington regarding energy policy. Now, at the same time, the U.S. is dealing with the fact that Saudi Arabia, supposedly the principal client of the U.S. in the region, or one of two principal clients, the other being Israel, is following a somewhat recalcitrant policy of its own from the U.S. point of view. So the U.S. problem here is, in order to control the region, it has to have the local authorities under proper control. It's sort of like a godfather who is a mafia godfather who has capos in different regions, and those capos have fallen out with one another, and that the godfathers attempt to bring one capo back into the concert works out to be to produce difficulties with another. This is the background to this Sunni-Shia fight that we're following, and we should remember too that the opposition of Sunni and Shia throughout the region is an artifact also of American policy. There was no such opposition when the U.S. invaded Iraq 14 years ago. The U.S. constructed the opposition while the invasion of Iraq was at stake, just as it had constructed jihadism itself in an earlier administration, during the Carter administration. So what the U.S. is dealing with now is a result of its own policies, and those policies are not in the interest, obviously, of the people in the region. It's the interest of the American ascendancy, the American 1%. So the Saudi Arabian Iranian contest at the moment is a contest between recalcitrant allies or potential allies of the United States. And that's why the U.S. is trying to make sure that this contradiction does not grow worse. It's a serious problem, and it's a problem about whether or not the U.S. is able to keep its clients in line. Comments? Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen?
Oh, sorry, not
Go
on
ahead.
that. No, I had comments, but I wanted to comment on Saudi.
On Saudi Arabia?
No, I did my thing on Saudi.
No.
Okay. Let's move on to some other questions. Ron, do you want to raise questions about what you've heard this evening?
Oh, no, I think that was a good statement by Stuart about solidarity versus divisiveness, or divisiveness, some people say. And yeah, I'm very much concerned about the way this is playing out. Another note in the news has been the increasing polarization in American politics. Greater and greater tendency, we see it going on in the presidential campaign again, to declare that the people who disagree with me politically, or who on the other side, are just evil, and it's impossible to maintain any kind of democratic dialogue and political conversation about goals and priorities and so on nationally, and that kind of atmosphere. And has the whole thing been so poisoned that we're incapable of carrying on any kind of dialogue and reasonable compromise? Well, more and more people are saying that, and it's an extremely bad sign.
I think the point that Stuart raised about solidarity and particularly regard questions of race contributes to this issue of polarization in an extremely significant way. I've argued for a while here that the modern original sin of American politics occurred about 40 years ago when American liberalism gave up its interest in class politics, such as it was growing out of the New Deal, the social democratic tradition of the New Deal and the Great Society, was abandoned by American liberals in the 1970s in favor of, as Stuart mentioned, identity politics. That is, each group, whether blacks, women, sexual minorities, anything, saying our people are being discriminated against, we have to bring them into we have to gain respect for them. Identity politics is about what's said, class politics is about what's done. And by giving up, by the great refusal of American liberalism in the 70s, giving up attempts to do anything about class politics and saying instead, no, we'll just make sure that everybody gets a fair shake, the U.S. set the stage for, U.S. liberals set the stage for very serious problems today. And the breakdown of the sort of solidarity that Stuart was talking about, and the polarization that Ron described. When you can have Americans, working class Americans, white Americans, saying, look, the government is doing everything for black people, or when you can have working class men saying, look, the government's doing everything for women, when you had any other group looking at these attempts to ameliorate the conditions of various identity groups, what you actually done is has set up a series of resentments that are played out politically. At the same time, the American working class, which is a majority of the population, is being immiserated, while inequality is growing, while people are being forced into more and more difficult economic circumstances. This has been the case even before the Great Recession of 2007 and 8, and it continues. This is the real enemy of solidarity. This is the real enemy of the sort of identification that is necessary, that will be necessary within American society at large to deal with its real problems. It serves the interests of the very small American elite, but it's against all the rest of our interests, and the prospects, as both these gentlemen have suggested, are not good.
My turn.
Sure.
And I have a lot to say on this topic. One of the reasons I got involved with AWARE was I'd seen the film, well, I had been watching and I heard Carl speaking about the pivot to Asia, and of course that appealed to me. But I also remember watching the film that UPTV6 did in place of an AWARE program one night entitled Obey. And it really, it takes you through the whole labor movement, which I embraced the socialist labor movement back in the 70s. Actually 1970, when I first heard the term socialism and had it explained to me what it meant. And I admit I'm a terrible Marxist. I don't know my Marx. I don't even know my Trotsky. But I've always embraced the goals and the ideals. Okay,
shame on you.
I'm sorry. I get glassy-eyed when I read Das Kapital, et cetera, and even the translations of Trotsky into English. But the goals, to me, are something worth embracing, and that's true egalitarianism. Okay, and it does mean changing the system, all right? There is no way out of that, and I think more and more people are beginning to see that today. It's one of the reasons that I initiated the conversation with some of my colleagues here about starting up, well, Carl and David Johnson and David Green. And I think it's because we're on the same page as far as changing the system goes. We don't embrace neoliberalism, which is basically it's reforms. And it's reforms being implemented to, as Carl just pointed out here, to assist individual groups. But it doesn't unite them. And the film Obey brings this out. It shows how by all these different groups standing up and fighting the injustice and abuse being perpetrated on us. But if we're not united, we are not going to survive. And I was hoping last year, when we started up the Green Party, that it would be an umbrella under which the various different groups operating within this community could join together, at least in respect to starting at the local level, getting people onto the local councils, etc., school board, whatever, with the same goals, all right, in mind of changing some of the things that have been occurring in our community. And it hasn't happened. So far, it hasn't happened. I'm still hopeful, but, you know, it hasn't happened yet.
Come, huh?
No, it hasn't come yet, not to the Green Party, not to the Prairie Greens here. But we're still working on it. Now, that's for electoral politics. But electoral politics, I don't believe are going to change anything. I think you've got to have mass movements. And this is something that I believe is about uniting the people. Occupy started out. They started out pretty good. Some people said, oh, well, they don't have a united goal. No, they didn't. But they all came together with their various different goals and concerns. And out of that, one would have hoped some leadership would have been built, but also some coming together and a recognition of the various different groups. I like what Gus Woods has had to say. Gus was on our program one time. He was on a program, Jason, you can tell me, that I think it's called Constitution. I think you filmed it here on UPTV 6 not too long ago. First Amendment, okay, First Amendment. And Gus, he's very well informed on Black Lives Matter. He talks about it, but he clearly recognizes that it's about system change, all right? Martin Luther King, maybe had he been allowed to survive, he might have taken up this movement because he clearly recognized, as Carl has pointed out, that it doesn't stop at our shores, that it's all connected. And there are two things, as Chomsky has pointed out, that are going to, even if we solve, like, I mean, to me, how do we solve the Black Lives Matter problem? I mean, you know, it's actually become now a point where you can't say, you can't say white lives matter. That's part of this speech that is now, oh no, you can't say that. I mean, because my temptation is to always say, look, Muslim lives matter, Asian lives matter, all lives matter. But it's politically incorrect in America today because they've taken up this Black Lives Matter, and if you say anything else, it appears you're diminishing Black lives. So here again, we are divided by identity politics. And I can remember living in Asia, I think I was in the Philippines, and one woman talking about, Western woman talking about giving 1,000 peso tip to the taxi driver because that's a lot of money in Philippine pesos because he did such a good job and he was so honest. And I thought, this Lady Bountiful attitude that some of us have when we go to undeveloped nations and we want to help the poor and we take up volunteerism. I've been there, I've done it all. But you soon learn to recognize that it doesn't solve any problems. In fact, it creates more problems sometimes. When it's kind of like the Oprah Winfrey thing of, we're going to give a car to one individual here, his lucky day, and everybody cheers. Or like, look, this person won the lottery. But what does the lottery actually do? It impoverishes most people because only one person out of thousands, millions are going to win that lottery. So this is what I think we have to look at. I mean, and Stuart, I don't mean to diminish your concerns in any way because I respect all of your concerns, and you're someone who has spent your life working in all of this, including anti-war. And I know what they were doing to people in Thailand in the late 80s, early 90s. I was working on a magazine, and they were building the World Trade Center in Thailand, in Bangkok. And so they were removing all the people who lived in the slums because they didn't want the foreigners coming in there and seeing them. And these people didn't want to leave, and they were fighting it. And one of my colleagues, also Westerner, he was like, I don't understand why they're going to build them nice housing. And I said, what can they do out in the middle of the boondocks? They can't even go out and beg, you know? I mean, they don't have jobs out there. So I understand this. And once he grasped the concept, and I think that's the problem here, some of what Carl says or writes regarding identity politics, perhaps when people see that, they're just grasping the bare essence. They're not really comprehending the full meaning behind it and what it means. And Carl, you're very articulate, so I know. But I think this is what the message has to get out, that we all have issues. And it doesn't mean that someone who has a particular concern or an issue. For me, it might be Asia. It is Asia. But at the same time, it doesn't mean I shouldn't work on that. But it does mean that I have to work with others as best I'm able to contribute. Not everyone we can only spread ourselves so thin. That's the issue, that's the problem. But I was hoping that many of the different organizations would come together and try to work with us. Make no mistake, the two major problems facing humanity today is proliferation of nuclear weapons and war and climate change, damaging our global warming. And if we don't solve those two problems, and I don't think we're going to solve any problems with what we call reforms or neoliberal implementation, or let's all love one another, I think the only way we're going to solve it is masses of people organizing together and forcing our governments and changing our whole system, the way it works.
Comment, Stuart?
I guess, let's see. I would like to say a couple of things. I mean, I don't, from some of the tone of what several of you just said, you might think that I think it's extremely important to say, as the Black Lives Matter movement says, that Black lives matter. And the reason that they're saying it is that Black lives have not mattered.
Right.
So have mattered much less than the life of somebody like me. That's been specifically neglected, and the important thing for seeing solidarity in that is that I can walk around with the assumption that my life is respected. If I had grown up black, as Ta-Nehisi Coates did and wrote about this, he couldn't make any such assumption like that. So without making a big stink about how, where different groups stand within the system of justice, within the economic system, if you don't make us think about it, people won't even know. There won't even be a basis to unify around, because for too many people, there's not a problem. So I don't want to talk about race in terms of division, but I do want to talk about race in terms of discrimination, because it makes it plain to people that discrimination is real, and it makes it clearer what the spectrum of conditions in our society is. If we pretend that race does not matter, we lose track of that essential fact.
But is
I could say
anybody
something
here
about the
saying
Doha
that
round
but is
also.
anybody here saying that it doesn't matter? When Carl is writing
We're
the
out of time. We'll go.
I guess we are.
Concluding.
2 points in a minute. Correction. I think Rabin, I said, was assassinated in 2005. Wasn't it 1995, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And objection. I don't know why Carl thinks that the Israel lobby doesn't have that much power, because there are other lobbies that are also exercising a lot of power on certain issues. So without denying that the gun and drug and military lobbies are also extremely powerful, I will reassert that the Israel lobby is incredibly powerful, and it's time to recognize that.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the first week of 2016. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.